First, a historical anecdote. In Giorgio Vasari's classic biographical text, The Lives of the Painters, the Italian Renaissance painter Correggio is struck by awe when he examines Raphael's luminous, vital, elegant masterpiece, the Sistine Madonna. Moved to such admiration and wonder, he makes an interesting remark. Anch'io sono pittore. I too am a painter. Now, what is this? It is not a statement of resentment or envy. Far from it. It's a statement of camaraderie and brothership. It's an understanding of what painting can accomplish. The wonders and mysteries of this art form that you have committed your life to through this elegant, transcendent work. You understand what everything you have learned, all the structures and traditions you have studied, are capable of creating, and you are a part of that process. The existence of such works elevate the trade of painting, and thus those who practice it. Now, that does not mean that simply being a painter, being in an art form that can produce such works as this, means that one has the prestige of a Raphael. It simply means that you are a part of that same system, that same set of techniques and perspectives unique to the artist that are capable of producing such brilliant, absolutely gorgeous and perfect work. Work that has the ability to transcend the banal and the petty inanity of the everyday. But this is not a statement that allows one to rest on their laurels. Correggio did not mean that simply because the work that Raphael created was of such a quality, and thus was a testament to the ability of painters to create work of that quality, that means that he can just revel in that glow of what painters in the abstract are capable of doing. No, it's a challenge, a responsibility of sorts. If there is the potential to create such brilliant, luminous works of art, then one inherits the struggle and the commitment to trying to match that ideal, trying to not necessarily copy Raphael, but be a part of the same tradition of artistry that led to the creation of works such as Raphael's Sistine Madonna. Now, you might wonder why I decided to start an essay on the Lord of the Rings like that, but I do think that this anecdote is telling in regards to the task that the team behind the new Lord of the Rings series, The Rings of Power, has before them. Looking at what Tolkien accomplished, they can say too, in wonder and a shade of intimidation, I too am an artist. I too am a writer. I too am a world builder. I too have the hypothetical ability to create work like this. Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings is, I think I can say this without exaggeration, the most famous work of fantasy storytelling of the century. When we think of modern fantasy, we think of Tolkien. And when we think of Tolkien, our image of him is inextricably connected to the ideas and philosophies of modern fantasy that he helped promulgate. Is that particularly fair to all the other great fantasy writers that came before him? Not really, but it is the landscape in which we find ourselves. I do not think the team behind the Rings of Power should try to directly copy Tolkien. If they do, they will forever be in the shadow of both him and the brilliant, era-defining Peter Jackson films, which managed to defy all expectations that they would be a pale imitation of the books to establish themselves as rich, vibrant tapestries of fantastical and mythological storytelling. I do think that the relation between the new team and Tolkien should be more like that of Correggio to Raphael in the anecdote I've just described. Tolkien demonstrates an ideal vision of what fantasy is capable of doing, not merely offering big battles with shocking twists and a whole bunch of mythology that doesn't make sense to even a lot of the people who read the books because it's so dense, but something much higher and more elevated than that. A vision of poignant, humanistic, and thoughtful storytelling that justifies the use of fantasy as a medium, even in the modern world, for telling real human stories. Works that unlock the potential to go beyond just the ordinary, shallow, superficial way of being that we inevitably fall into in the modern world, a world dominated by mechanical repetition and routine. This is what all great art does, fantasy or otherwise, but fantasy, because of its explicit distancing itself from the world of the mundane, has, I believe, a higher ability to do so. Tolkien certainly thought so. And so, the existence of a work like The Lord of the Rings ennobles fantasy as a genre. It demonstrates what it is capable of, and thus bestows upon those who wish to follow in its footsteps a responsibility and a burden, a glorious burden, to not just copy all the orcs and hobbits and ents that are the external indicators of The Lord of the Rings as a franchise, but to really go deeper into the essence of the Lord of the Rings world, all of that beauty and torment, all of that mythical longing, that sense of being in this enchanted, animistic world where you have the ability to access a space beyond mere conventionality. And yes, there is darkness, and yes, there is true horror, and it is not the cartoony, big bad horror, but the true existential dread that eats away at the human spirit, but can nonetheless be beaten back by a sense of light, a sense of goodness and morality that exists within the individual, but also goes beyond the individual into the histories and traditions of the world, and a sense of connection to the earth and to the natural environment. I'm sorry if it sounds like I'm gushing. I am, to a certain extent, but I do think it's worth taking a step back to really think about why The Lord of the Rings is so beloved. Because it was very much out of step with its age. No one was writing like this in the 1950s. To William S. Burroughs, or even to Hemingway, The Lord of the Rings might as well be something that was written 1,000 years ago for how little it relates to the post-war literary zeitgeist. Tolkien was a man out of his time. He was perhaps the last generation still in touch with a certain pre-modern medievalist fantasia that had already very much started to die several centuries before. Now it had been revived by the Romanticists, and more explicitly by the likes of William Morris and John Ruskin before him, both of whom celebrated the bards and artisans of an age before the onset of industrialization and commercialism, and the breaking of our ties with the earth and these sets of values and communities that had been passed down for generations and generations. But, of course, both Morris and Ruskin are serious intellectuals. They have been called backwards-looking, they've been called nostalgic by a lot of people, but they're still regarded quite highly because of the wild brilliance of their writing and their ability to cover a vast array of different sociological and political and artistic issues. They very much defined the world of the 19th century Victorian England in terms of creating a distinct artistic scene that was against the whole drive toward industrialization and the emphasis on productivity and efficiency that defined the mainstream of Victorian society. They provided a good counterculture, in a sense. But Tolkien didn't, in a way, at least not from his perspective. His time had already passed. Ruskin and Morris were very much of their time. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis perhaps belonged to that 19th century milieu, but were born decades too late. As much as that, they belonged to the Middle Ages. Reading those works, you feel very similar to cracking open a chivalric Arthurian legend for the first time. Being a bit distanced from it, but pulled in by the lushness of the world created therein. But we still celebrate Tolkien. We still love him. Even as the intellectuals did not. They called him passé. Even in personal experience, I can say that when I was interviewed by a Yale person when I was applying to Yale as a high school senior, I said that I really got invested in The Lord of the Rings as a teenager, and that's what got me into literature, which is true. And she was like, "Oh, well, that's great. Now, what have you been reading since then?" Just very dismissive. And yet, Tolkien still speaks to that part of us that does not necessarily reduce the world to moral binaries. Tolkien didn't, but believes that there is something pure and unsullied and ancient and beautiful beyond the irony and the postmodern malaise of the everyday. That is a lot for the news show to live up to, and to a certain extent, I don't think it can. These people are inevitably going to be coming at it from a very different perspective than the idiosyncratic viewpoint of Tolkien. But that's not a bad thing, as long as they allow themselves to aspire to that ideal of what fantasy can be, created by works like The Lord of the Rings and people like Tolkien, to be like Correggio looking up at Raphael for inspiration and a sense of responsibility, instead of just merely copying the superficial elements of The Lord of the Rings. So thank you all for watching. If you liked what you saw today, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Donate to my Patreon if you can and you want to see more videos like this. Wow, I had a lot to say here. Let's hope the Rings of Power are great. Adios, comrades.